The talk, yeah, so today the talk that I'm hoping to give for the next little time is on this concept of restoring civic health in a culture of distance, media, and the challenge of proximal belonging. So I'll share this talk and then hopefully we can have a short discussion ahead of lunch. But the ideas that are coming out of this today are a little bit more, it's focused on the new research projects that we're heading into. So it won't be as much detailing past work, but speaking a little bit forward. And if you are interested in some of the global work that is happening, a lot of the ideas here emerge from that. I'm happy to share that more with folks here at lunch or at any time after this talk. It's also a real kind of core passion of mine is to be thinking about media and culture across borders and across divides. And so this is something that I've been passionate about. Okay, so I will dive in. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. I have one mic on and I didn't want to have two mics, and so the power out makes it easy just to have one mic. So as Tanya mentioned, my work is really at the intersection of civic media communities and participation in the world. And I've spent my time as a researcher and a practitioner working in and with communities, thinking about the relationship between their agency, their ability to advocate, and the media systems that support them. It's taken me into spaces of media literacy, of news and citizenship, and of thinking about what communities need to thrive in equitable and inclusive ways. I am based at Emerson College in Boston, Mass. Has anyone ever heard of Emerson College? Yeah, all right, there we go. Do you? Who? Do you know Kate Eichhorn? Oh my goodness. We have to connect after. Okay, I sit right next to Kate. I love Kate. Oh, that's awesome. Okay, great. All right. Yeah, okay, that's one connection. So Emerson College it's an urban college in Boston. It sits right along the back half of the Common. It owns most of the theaters in the city of Boston Theater District. It's the School of Communication and School of the Arts. So it's got, it's for what it does it quite well. And it's an interesting space. You're in a very kind of urban environment and you're thinking a lot about the intersection of communities and all of the spaces around them. So that's where I make my home. If you're ever in Boston, it's a wonderful place to come and visit. And if you're lucky, there's a lot of cool things happening that you can get discounts to. So that's good too. So I'm gonna start my talk with this, and Tanya, you'll know this quote from before. I'm gonna start today's talk by this is something that's stuck with me since the end of the book that Tanya showed and the work that I've done in between. This talk today it started from, I was asked by a foundation in the United States to write a report for the foundation on the directions that media and democracy are heading in. So like small task, very easy thing to do. You know, I thought it'd take me a weekend. Oh, just in the United States, media and democracy. That's gonna be simple. So, and this quote kept coming back in as I started thinking about what foundations need to think about the directions they go in. I kept coming back to what are some of the challenges and some of the new ways we can think about the intersections of media and civic life. And Michael Bugeja, who's a longtime communication media scholar and leader who's worked in the context of the United States, in his book, Interpersonal Divide in the Age of the Machine, he wrote in a very subtle point in the book that in the age of ubiquitous media, we struggle with the rigors of the human condition. And as someone who had studied the intersection of media and technology and citizenship, I often got frustrated with us trying to reduce and dichotomize things into where the health and the challenges, where is the things that are good and bad. You know, it's in some ways, you always kind of ended up in this same place. And I always kept coming back to this idea of like, oh, in this age, like his view on this was that what's happening is that we're struggling with the ability to be human. That's what he noticed. And he talked about the values of being human, the ideas of how we engage, how we feel each other, how we interact in proximal and physical environments. And this is something that I had kept close with me. So as I went down this path, I started with some research and some deep reading. And I started to think about this idea of an interesting way to frame thinking about our relationship to our communities in digital life is through the space of thinking about distance. proximal distance and mediated distance. So this gives us like a notion of thinking a little bit differently, an entryway in. And I want to talk a little bit about this idea of distance and a concept of civic distance, which is what I ended up using as my frame for this report. That's what's based on the talk today. And then I'll talk about mediated environments and distance, and then some of the work that we've done to address this in the end. And I'm going to start with an emerging metaphor. Tanya, you can grade me on this if it's actually improved since the last time you heard me talk about it. But at the beginning of this, and there's a new book that we're working on around this, but we try to introduce proximity versus distance. So I'll just take you all through a little thought experiment that has to do with the metal and glass of being in a car and the metal and glass of being inside a mobile phone. And I want to just walk through this, and please, you can rip apart the comparison, that's fine. It's not like an academic thought. I never thought I'd be doing research on like the impact of time spent in automobiles. It has changed the way I approach driving. It's very strange because I've gotten nervous about it. So this is a picture of cars and traffic. Has anyone experienced that here? Okay, good. That's a joke. You didn't have to answer. Yeah. I feel like we all know this happens in the world. The idea of being surrounded by the metal and glass of an automobile, oftentimes alone, sometimes with other people, and oftentimes having to negotiate a lot of information in real time without needing to engage in the rigors of interaction that might accompany the thoughts and decisions and feelings that you have. And in the same regard, I'm thinking about the metal and glass of the mobile phone. So this is a picture I took we brought our daughters here, not our son. He was too young and had other fun things to do. And this was their first time being younger without phones, that they saw this when they thought going to see the Mona Lisa would be really interesting. And this is me in the back showing them what it's like to look at a piece of art. And they were just fascinated, you know? And then they were asking me and my partner for our phones. Like, hey, give us your phones so we can do that too. And that was not the point. So this became like, and then, you know, by the time, it was just fascinating in so many ways. And these pictures aren't new. Like, you know, if you start looking at this, you'll see all these examples of people with that. But then I got one myself and I felt really proud. I was like, I did it. I figured out this. So the metaphor goes something like, or the idea of distance, and the argument that I'm making in my work is that that over time we've cultivated distance between us and the proximal environments and the rigors of human relationships that we need to function effectively in our daily lives. Is that?
It says it's an exhibition.
Oh, I love it.
Guessing that they really think
Okay, that's totally fine. I saw you laughing and I was like, wait, is there something else that I need to, all right?
We're just guessing here.
That's totally fine, yeah. So I'm just going to play this out quickly for you all here. So again, thinking about this metaphor to introduce the argument that I'll make, both of these things expand the constraints of our physical distance, right? They enable us to have new connections. They enable a lot of the research I read on cars, and I wish that was a joke, but you know, there's a wonderful thing about expanding the physical constraints of the world, right? And they've arguably reshaped the world as much as most anything else, infrastructure-wise, broaden our communities, provide flexibility and autonomy, and created needed efficiencies, you know, at scales of population growth. I would say that I could argue that these things you could apply to mobile technologies, our platforms, and our digital culture in the same way you might apply for this. At the same time, these two technologies extract indirect resources. They promote individualism, right? They atomize us in ways. They ask us to make judgments without the rigor of human interaction. So I don't know if you've had this experience of driving, where if someone else does something that's incorrect, the first response is not to think that maybe they're having a bad day, maybe they've just had an argument with a spouse, maybe they have a sick family member. Your first instinct is to call them something really bad and hate them in that moment. And then it passes and you kind of calm down, right? And this is the type of behavior we see happening in mediated environments as well, that the idea of like the design of these environments to give us information in ever sensational and fleeting ways evokes the implicit neural reactions to this point of spectacle. And then we are forced to kind of simmer down again and move forward. We lose that. And I'm not saying that my arguments today are not going to be that we need to go back in time, although we always are nostalgic about the past. I've learned this as an old man now, that I start talking to people like when I was your age, but that's different. But we are asked to make judgments without the rigor of human interaction. And I argue that this is not like a phenomenon that's one-off. This is like cultivation. Over time, as we normalize these habits, they become ways that we see the world. Negotiate fleeting information in real time. So just like the automobile has all of these things coming at you at once, you've learned to habitually navigate. You don't think every time, right? This is what we've conditioned ourselves to do for those that are driving. And again, as a professional automotive researcher, I know this. And then like with the phone too, we negotiate fleeting information in real time. And then we're forced to jump to conclusions because that's the design of these things. Just like we hate the person that accidentally took a wrong turn, we hate the person that posts something inflammatory. And that's how we viscerally react. And these are things that I've been thinking with research. Okay, so quite quickly to move beyond this, with cars, we have regulations. And I've been reading this in the United States context, so just obviously if things are different in this context, I apologize, that's the constraints of where I'm looking right now. Regulations exist because there's physical implications, right? We build regulation on automobiles because otherwise you'd have like physical death. And that's a good reason to start regulations, right? So promote physical safety to support infrastructure. That costs a lot of time to protect the environment in times like this one oscillates in the United States. To facilitate social cohesion, social cohesion, like there are rules to avoid people just going crazy. Although I spent a lot of time doing research in the Middle East and those rules are much lower there. And in other places, like where I spend summers in Austria, those rules are very strict around the social cohesion of what the rules are for driving and to structure correct behavior. That is all done because there's a very real transactional relationship between automobile and society. In our digital life, regulation, although I know there's a regulation that is here now around social media, but around mobile technologies, there's some latent regulations around extreme content, blatant harm, and privacy protections. In the United States, that's all been basically stripped back to nothing right now. And that's the least of our concerns. So the other reason why it's hard to think about these in regulatory terms is that there's not the direct harm. Like a colleague of mine the other day was saying, we now have almost 2 decades of research into mobile technologies and their impact. So it's no longer emerging, but the first mobile phones came around to like completely smart enabled phone to mass societies, at least in the US, came around 2007. So we have a number of research infrastructures, but the way that there's not indirect, we don't think about it in terms of harm. We think about it in terms of mental health. We don't think about it in terms of physical harm, so it's a much difficult area to engage with. We know that at the extreme ends of using these tools, there are adverse effects. So we know this. The more time you spend this is great, it's also why I changed my behaviors. The more time you spend in a car in traffic, the shorter your lifespan is. The more time you spend, like associated with anxiety, stress, and increased incidence of violence, which is fascinating. And the results show that like over time, you normalize that feeling of being stressed, of feeling constrained, of having to negotiate. So that creates a problem. And then we know that in the United States, we have this, a lot of new research that's come out, everything from our Surgeon General, when our government used to still fund research, showing that higher incidences of unregulated social media use at younger ages leads to anxiety and depression, self-identity issues, stress and lack of confidence, lower emotional competencies, so much so that in a report in 2024, our Surgeon General in the United States has advocated for public health warnings on social media platforms. So this is like treating it, it's a really interesting idea. it's not a ban like has been, kind of put forth here, but it's turning it into it's treating it like you would treat smoking or recycling or something like that. It's a public health issue. Okay, how is everyone feeling about this comparison? Okay, feel okay? Okay, not allowed to poke holes in it because it's not very well thought out. It's just, it's just a way for me to kind of argue that the argument made by introducing this does two things. It tries to shift the perspective of thinking about our engagement with our physical and daily life in heavily mediated times to one of proximity, of distance versus connection, of how do we feel close to things in mediated spaces and in human spaces. And it also allows us, it shifts conversations from good or bad to closeness and distance. And it allows us to reimagine what that feels like. We have I once say that in my experience working with communities, mediated technologies and platforms have done so much, right? And we know that. They've provided spaces for underserved and marginalized communities to have access to resources and people that they might not. Groups that are vulnerable physically, especially in places that are so segregated like the United States, find real value in being able to leverage outside of spaces where they don't have the capacity to meet and find support that they need, right? So we understand this. I put these two pictures here because it does create efficiencies. Telehealth creates efficiencies, online learning, opportunities to expand the bounds for learning creates opportunities to reach more people. So we understand that. But the argument we make is in this bounty of communication technologies at our disposal, we're composed of more mediated experiences than ever before, yet we're more atomized ever before. That's the argument we are finding in our research, and the one that we think is cultivated over time by mediated environments. So I'll give three kind of implications of this deep mediation and distance, and then talk a little bit about what we're doing to respond to that. And then keep in mind that kind of car and distance. And I would welcome conversation and feedback on it for sure, because there are other examples we've been thinking about, ways that we've become atomized that aren't just technologies, but I'll leave those for later. We wrote a kind of theoretical piece in 2 years ago around this, the implications of distance and deep mediation. So I'll take you through these quickly. Extractive media infrastructures, they fill relational voids. And you all know this anecdotally, but we've been doing research, a new research project with young people that have been involved in our global project of at points where, and I find this myself, at points where there's opportunities for human negotiation or human engagement, we often fill those relational voids with our mediation, with points of mediation, whether it's taking out your phone, whether it's finding a way to kind of hide behind a screen of some sort. That becomes quite common with young people. It's a learned behavior over time. Hollowing out of local media infrastructures. This is one that I'm quite involved in the United States, looking at hyper-local media and its impact, and I'll show you some research results there. And the third one is this idea of civic cynicism. So the new research report came out, it's showing kind of the results of distance and mediation without local connectivity, right? And I will just say again, very quickly, that this all comes from the United States context. I don't pretend to speak. I have no idea what's actually happening in the United States now. It's a very hard time to understand how things are. It's a very challenging time. And all this work is, there's not within the last 2 months. So I can try to share some of the context in that case, but it's a challenging time. So one way to look at mediation and distance. So Jamie Susskind just put out a book called The Digital Republic, in which he really talks about market individualism. So as I look at it as a cultivation of distance, he looks at it as unaccountable power. Over time, his argument is really, he looks a lot at the notion of democracy and what does that mean. And he said, unaccountable power erodes the bonds of community that hold us together and undermines the capacity of democratic institutions. We feel that struggle now in the United States, and it does so inadvertently without anyone intending for it. I think he wrote that before seeing what's happening now, that unaccountable power of mediated institutions to just accrue and accrue unintentionally atomizes an individual. And he said, it's born from an allegiance to the individual pursuit of self-interest. One of the things that I look at in my research in the media literacy space is there's almost like an implicit and unintentional prioritizing of the individual. So in the media literacy world, which is about how we prepare people, it's often that if we can give you the skills to better navigate media and technology, then all of a sudden we'll be better. And then that can lead to some very kind of individual perspectives in this. Oh, this is a pretty picture. It's just there for fun. No, I'm just kidding. Does anyone know what this is? I've never seen one in real life, but I'm looking at it. This is in California, something called a super bloom. And it's a physical, it's this physical phenomenon. I'm not an expert in this. If you ask me about cars and human health, I can tell you anything you want to know. This is a new book that just came out. So this apparently happens as it's like a spontaneous emergence in this one natural environment of a beautiful canopy of natural growth of flowers. And it looks fantastic. As someone who does a lot of gardening and growing of flowers, this looks like a dream, right? And there's and it happens all at once. And the author is a new book called Super Bloom. And he starts off the book, I just finished reading before I came here, talking about how much this is being destroyed by humans trying to capture it with their technologies. This is what he does this metaphor for technology, Nicholas Carr. He calls a super bloom like a digital super bloom, which is like pixelated. He kind of creates that comparison of the technologies of connection tearing us apart. It's not a new argument, but another one of thinking about mediation and distance, right? That when we bring news and entertainment, conversation, all other forms of human expression are from now on in direct competition. And he says, angling for both the consumer's fleeting attention and the algorithm's blessing. Is that the issue now is not like, we were talking about this in our workshops that Tanya and colleagues were running, about we all need media for escape, right? I like to watch basketball lots. I just do a lot of sports. And it's really nice to have that escape. We all like to tuck into our technologies, but normally we kind of have understood the bounds for those. But when you put political information with entertainment, with conversation, everything together inside of these spaces, his argument is that they're just starting to atomize us, and they create this super bloom effect where he says everything is happening all at once and it grows and everybody runs to it, right? Seeking for that moment of attention or that moment of spark. And this is kind of it's taking up our cognitive availability. That's the argument, is we don't actually have time to be present in that space. When you're in a museum and you're all trying to get that resonant thing with the Mona Lisa, when you're at the super bloom, the argument, and one that for me, I see more and more in our research, is that you lose the cognitive availability to be present for others because it's all being taken up by a super bloom that doesn't end. It's every day you get involved in that super bloom. And reels are the new, do you guys, anyone here, the invention of the reels in the social spaces is the newest place where people kind of it's the evolution of kind of getting sucked in. And the last kind of argument that we make is around, we'll talk about what's leading to the hollowing out of local media. So as national media have become larger with more resources, at least in the United States, it's very interesting. The biggest journalism outlets are the most responsible for the death of the local news because they have figured out ways to hyper-focus onto communities. It's almost like super segmenting with marketing. So this is another really interesting argument showing that as they've gone into kind of hyper-focusing on news audiences, the companies with more resources end up overtaking local spaces, and they're using the same tactics that large networks or that social media or that purveyors of misinformation are to actually go and take over the local news and journalism outfits, getting more eyeballs their way. They hyper-target and hyper-focus again. So if you're the New York Times, and I live in a rural kind of community outside of Boston, they will know how to target my region and provide news and engagement and advertising, all that techniques, diverting people's eyeballs away through social networks. And so the result is, in this text, that the more that that operation works within news spaces, it's hollowing out the necessary local infrastructures that we need to have a vibrant connection to our communities. And so what is a hollowing out? I know we have this is a report that just got published. So if I just kind of to reset a little bit, like this idea of deep mediation and distance. So what are the media environments that are causing, like what are the implications of this? We talk about this idea of like the lack of kind of constraint of our mediated spaces to provide us opportunities to connect. And then we talk about the sheer ubiquity has hollowed out local media environments. And that is really where the civic health part of it is. So by every indicator that you can read, a lack of a local media infrastructure leads to more polarization, less connection into the community resources, less care for education, actually it's funny, in the United States there was a study that was just done saying where there's no local media, the taxes and the amount of corruption are the highest, even in small places, because people don't have a place to learn things and they're not as stringent on understanding how that works. So this is Northwestern does an annual local news infrastructure, and this is the only places that have local news left, at least one outlet, are here in yellow. The rest are nowhere. This is digital sites. So there has been this argument that technologies are replacing local media infrastructure in the United States. And it's actually not the case at all. The real case is that the larger media companies are replacing them. But all the digital sites that started have crumbled under the kind of consumeristic dictates that run online. So there is no stability for local digital sites. And I'll talk about later what we've found is working is a return in small environments to print. There's also the only digital places work in larger areas, not in rural areas. So there's a big divide between urban and rural resources for this. And in the United States, that's extra challenging. This is not just a US phenomenon. Just to show you, for example, in Brazil, they have the same issues that are happening, and you can find it elsewhere. Another piece of research that came up around hollowing local news and the implications on civic health are the Tao Center at Columbia did a report on what happens when you get news deserts. It's not that just local news comes in, it's hard to create. It's that they call them pink slime sites sometimes, I don't know if you heard that name, but they're hyper-local kind of political sites that masquerade as news operations. And they have a very nuanced, a very media literate way to kind of push you into one corner or not. And those have been taking the place of the local news infrastructures. And so as in this study, they were kind of talking about hyper-partisan sites masquerading as local news, and saying we started, some of them get called out, some of them exist, but in a space of information, kind of digital information, it actually doesn't matter if you debunk those or not, because it's already done. The information is already circulated. It's helped people find things that align with their values, and then it moves forward from there. And then, this is just something that just got published in terms of in our last election, the Republican Party under President Trump won 91% of the counties with no information. That's fascinating. It's not just an anecdotal thing, but it shows you inserted political power where places aren't actually having a robust way to talk about local news. I don't have any insight into how this exists here, but it's a really interesting potential way to think about what happens when you hollow out local. So, and this is kind of where the argument, the last part of this distance and mediated environments that I want to make is around the emergence of civic cynicism in a project that I've just part of, a national project in the United States showing just a rise of rampant cynicism around just every social and civic structure. And we always say that strong public institutions are what helps keep societies able to function, especially in times of political upheaval. And when you get to the point of there's almost all these confluence these confluences of activities happening. So, we have kind of unmitigated access to digital technologies with very little regulation or oversight, combined with a hollowing out of any local connection. So what's happened in the United States is just a uptick in like a lack of belief in many of the institutions that guide us. So this is just one way to think about. Douglas Rushkoff writes about this in Team Human. Socialization depends on both autonomy and interdependence. Emphasizing one at the expense of the other compromises the balance, right? So this is one way in which we have to kind of consider this. And deep mediation, that idea of distance and the reliance on the phones, the argument is that like it actually is born from autonomy, but it really kind of, it doesn't remove you. But my argument again is that it cultivates over time less interdependence because you have less cognitive availability to be with others. And this is the thing that we're researching now. So in this study, this was a study done, just finished. It's not, just got released, and a lot of coverage in the press around this. It was done by a group of US universities, LSU, University of Maryland, and the University of Chicago were the lead institutions, and other scholars that are interested in media and civic engagement. And just a couple of very brief findings before we turn to the next level of work here. So cynicism measured at levels higher than they've ever seen it before about the country in the future. That's not, I don't know why that doesn't seem so surprising right now to me, but it's, Americans have lost faith in the fundamental principles underlying their democracy. So what does that look like? And the only place where there seemed to be like consensus in this national kind of sample survey was they were united around the notion of distrusting of the public bodies and the institutions, right? And so a couple of things that are really interesting. They found 5 archetypes in the survey: ambivalent, classically liberal, mostly MAGA. MAGA is the Make America Great Again. I didn't want to say that here, but I have. The disillusioned and the believers, right? So, the interesting about this is that in the survey, there was actually higher self-reporting. So we always find like people don't read news anymore. And actually about the government and actively seeking out news, most people reported like higher news engagement than they have, and a lot with like specific specific spaces that they go to. So there's no, the just attempt of going to the news places that fit what they want to learn about. But it wasn't that people are tuning out of news except for the disillusioned. But I would imagine if you were disillusioned, you would just check out of everything. It's the connection here is, well, I'll just put that up quickly, but the connection here is that they are more connecting to news that suits their values, the news that's not necessary, they're not necessarily just tuning out. They're tuning in more and more, but in a space where there's less and less connection to anything that would be beyond themselves and their views. And that is like the real danger, I think, around this. As we know, I just put this up here because I think it's really interesting in the US context when we think about, I was thinking about this in terms of where does cynicism come from? How does cynicism and distrust happen? Well, it's not that there's just outright lies, but it's almost just an abstraction. What you see in the news is just super sensational, super spectacular, clinging to emotions, but also it's not that they're just openly lying about news. And this is a book that was written in the 80s that is a really cool little book by a Harvard scholar, philosopher, where he actually, he calls it On Bullshit. Sorry to swear. I don't know if that's, my apologies in the camera. And he said, bullshit is speech intended to persuade without regard for truth, where the liar cares about the truth and attempts to hide it. Now you can see both happening, but I think like in our media environment in the United States, it's one that's predominated by bullshit and lies, but more of just it's just persuading anything without regard for the truth. It actually has nothing to do with what's happening. And in atomized and unregulated spaces, it's pushed us further and further into those realities, right? And so as a result, research that we've just finished, this group, shows that we are more cynical about every element, right? Across every element of public institutions that matter. And so this leads me to the last little part of my talk today. What does it mean to belong in a culture of distance? So the argument that we're making in this report and the follow-up research and some of the work we're done, the challenge, the way that we're framing the problem is that we have inserted a lot of distance into the life. So going back to that rigors of the human condition. So at every time where we're in places like this, where you actually feel me, you might think I don't agree with that, or I don't like the way he's saying this, or I like this, but we're in the rigor, so we can engage here. That at most every points of our kind of cognitive availability, we're inserting distance into those rigors through heavy mediation, through atomization, through kind of choosing individual more and more. And there's a whole notion of statistics around this, but and in my regard, this has to do with inevitably when you are inserting distance and then you're hollowing out the connection to local communities, you end up not even understanding what the institutions do for you to support civic health, to support programs that matter. So we are going through a thing now where higher education in the United States, but also everything that's social, that supports all members, especially those that need support more, ends up being less and less supported. And there's one thing that we mentioned in this, which is less people than ever before have met a journalist or a local town official or anyone that would run in those social circles than they have before. And if they do read and see about them, news, it's often in this context of a large political issue that's abstracted away from the communal. So the argument that we're making is about recentering proximity in our digital culture. And this is not about going backwards to say that we just need to stop with all this. We are in a heavily mediated environment, and that's not a bad thing, right? This is just, it's like the automobile. You're not going to stop that. You're just going to kind of adjust. And so what we're looking at now is what does it mean to recenter proximity in digital culture? And something called the proximity principle, which says those people in closer proximity with others are more likely to form relationships and engage in collective pursuits. And so this is what has been, I think, in our sense, this has been the framing of this has been the challenge. How do you build proximity back into mediated daily life? What does that mean to build proximity back into that? I don't think I was thinking about this in terms of I took the train out here with Alex. Thanks, Alex. Good ride, good conversation. And the idea a lot of people are engaged in their technologies, and that's fine, right? And if you're not engaged in your technology, you kind of might be a little bit creepy. When I'm riding around Boston, the one person who's not in their phone has nowhere to look, and it ends up being quite awkward, right? And but then I was looking at pictures I don't know why it came up a picture of the old days of people commuting, and everyone had their head in a newspaper. But you kind of, you were arm in arm and you could see what people were reading, and now you can't. So I'm not arguing that we need to go back to some old days, but I am really interested in thinking about how do you prioritize proximity in digital culture? And we've been working on a lot of interventions in that way. And one thing I want to bring up on this is a way that what framing we're looking for proximity is this new book called The Vanishing Neighbor. People tend to have their close group of inner ring family, and I love this argument, inner ring family, and then a vast online outer ring of contacts, right? But they're less likely to be involved in what he calls the middle ring, which is where you actually build trust in the world. And he's saying that technologies have actually made our inner rings really strong. So when everyone says that these technologies are good, it's because I'm here now. My kids don't believe that if I don't send them a picture of some wildlife that looks weird, they don't think I'm here. But they tell me, like, where's the picture of the kangaroo or the wallaby? They ask that like 20 times a day. It's really nice to be here for a long time and feel connected. Like, my inner ring is still very full here. Like, nothing stops, right? Like, I can't help at home, but, you know, like, I literally just said goodnight to my 7-year-old before I started talking. Like, that's cool, right? That's like what he's talking about, like a close group of inner ring family. And he said, like, I'm putting this here, and that's a very sophisticated picture. There's an inner ring and a middle ring and an outer ring, right? See what I did there? Good. So the middle ring is where we learn tolerance, acceptance, reality. This is what Dunkelman says. And he says, this is a space where you have acquaintances, loose friendships, and social engagement. Technology in large ways created ever closer bonds with our families, loved ones, and existing close connections, the inner rings of our lives, right? It's actually increased that, and that's where it's like become a thing that's wonderful. And because they allow for constant connection, they've replaced our time spent with our middle ring. We're always kind of going back there. And the real problem is that because we're always connected in digital spaces, we are constantly feeling depleted, exhausted, and like we need just to be alone to relax. Like, you don't get that space. So we don't have time to make the decisions to engage in that middle ring. Now, I'm not, like, this is, again, I'm looking at the United States, and this is a general cross-section. There are a lot of, this cuts ways, like, there are a lot of different engagement, socioeconomic factors, you know, issues of mobility and resources. This, in the United States, this is a huge one of inequity. Most of the time, strong middle rings are reserved for middle and upper class economic backgrounds. So I can always say, oh, well, I'm very involved. Well, that's because, you know, I don't have the same conditions and constraints and limitations as other people do. And that's something to really keep important. But still, you know, the work that we're putting forth now is like, how do you actually build back that middle ring without sounding like you just have to shut everything off? Although that might be the healthy way to do it. So what we're framing is around this idea of civic intentionality. And the book that Tanya shared, thank you for bringing that. Yeah, we write a lot about like human engagement in an age of digital abundance, and we use this term civic intentionality. And we have a new book coming out called Equitable Media Literacies, which will be out in the summertime, which is really, it's like recentering belonging. And it talks a lot about how do you work with community stakeholders and learning institutions to recenter human engagement in a media literacy experience. And so we call this reprioritizing a human agenda for digital lives, holistic engagement with media that emerges from the intersection of the personal and the public, the critical, the creative, the concept, and the application. And so, you know, we have been doing a lot of research and work. We worked on something called Roadmap for Local News, an emerging approach to meeting civic information needs. There are local news startups that are happening everywhere. We use the term civic media in terms of civic intentionality to talk about how we produce and reproduce a sense of being in the world with others towards the common good. So in our research, we have been using interventions where working with communities to not start with fighting misinformation through having conversations about where do you get your media, how can you better understand credibility from not credibility, how do we distinguish fact, how do you balance your media use? Those are all really good questions. We are focused on what issues do we care about, what is our relationship to those, how do we care in the world? We are really good at caring about things, and we're really good at signaling our care about things. We've become quite adept at caring for things. What are the efforts to actually care for things? And in an age where we're constantly asked to care about things, and we're asked to signal care about things, we've replaced caring for with caring about. And that's created a problem, and one we're trying to rectify through bringing groups of communities together and researching what motivates them to care for, what allows them to feel like they have space, what are the conditions they need to be engaged in the practice of caring for, and then how can they use media meaningfully to help sustain and advocate that care. This is a more recent book published about a year and a half ago that has these principles for restorative civic practices. We use care and imagination and agency as a way to frame. This book was all about our kind of looking at media pedagogies and how they can help us reposition relation and belonging and proximity at the center of mediated life. My argument here is again, not that we're going to replace or go back, but if the problem is one of feeling more distant, as we've identified, in the way that we engage with our larger civic collective pursuits, and we've lost the ability to locally be there, we be present and understand those relationships. We are working on very small levels with groups of communities and young people to think about how they can re-engage with the proximal environments. I work a lot with younger people, like not really young, and I will say that there's always this kind of, in the United States, this notion of disengagement and just kind of digitally dependent in unhealthy ways, and I'll say that's the opposite from the truth. Young adults and people at the beginning of their kind of engaging in informal social worlds are really engaged and passionate and care more than most, and enabling ways for them to come together and be present in a hyper-local way is super powerful. And so this is what some of the work that we have done. And I can leave it here because I know we're at 12:30. This is the last project that I'm happy to share with you where we actually articulate kind of our own, based on our research findings, a pathway forward, helping community stakeholders think about proximity and engagement and belonging when they're working with stakeholder groups that are trying to advance social change with and through media. So I think I'll leave it here, and just to recap, that notion of distance for me is a really interesting framing, and it leads us for our work to think about that relationship between proximity, belonging in physical and digital spaces. So thank you for listening, and thank you for engaging with the television screen. I appreciate that, and welcome for a discussion. Thank you.